All right. Well, it has begun. So I suppose that the first question that I should ask you that is, you were in you were in Russia in the '90s. When exactly were you in Russia, uh, at that point during that period?
Yeah, and the exactly is a little fuzzy, but it was within the first year after the fall of the Soviet Union. And given that I was in shirt sleeves and it was later in the year, I suspect it was probably late summer, early fall
Late summer, early fall of what then?
of
1992.
1992. Yeah.
1992. And I guess then the next logical question to ask is, why were you there?
It was interesting because, as you're aware, I've been over the years litigating patent cases. And at that time, I was representing a Japanese client who had been sued for infringement in the United States, in Wisconsin, actually, I think was where the suit was filed, by a German company on an old German patent on a method of making sand molds for casting pieces of metal. And it was interesting because, as the defendant, we were trying to prove that the patent was not valid, that there was prior art that covered it. And we immediately, as we typically would do, started looking for prior art in the United States, going back through whatever publications we could find or other patents we could find, looking for prior art. And we discovered, to our surprise, that there really wasn't a U.S. industry in casting metal any longer. By the early 1990s, that technology was long gone by the time this patent suit was filed. And so the
I
only
suppose that that says something going forwards, that you were going to the former Soviet Union to find something that was 30 years out of fashion in the United States.
And that was essentially the idea. When we started looking, what we found were fairly recent, but old enough to be of value for the lawsuit to predate the filing of the patent. Prior art written by people both at the Moscow Automotive Institute and the Kharkov Automotive Institute in Ukraine. And we looked up the prominent authors on all the articles that we could find, and uh, got very positive responses from them that they'd be happy to meet with us to advise us as to what was out in the world, to start looking for prior art for us, actually, that might be lurking around the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, so
And
at that point, yeah, so clearly far enough behind that you could still search for that type of prior art there in the former Soviet Union.
yep.
So, I mean, I suppose the next logical question is, given that around that time you were looking for prior art that was, again, 30 years behind, what was the rest of, you were in Moscow, correct?
Yeah, I was able, I was born in 1953, and I was in my probably late 30s, early 40s when I was there, and I was struck when I got there by how much Moscow looked like my memory of a big city in the United States in the early 60s. The architecture, just the atmosphere was seemed behind the times for the United States by far. And it did strike me as though it resembled 1960s United States. And I'll go one further, and I've always mentioned this. It always struck me as though Moscow looked to me like 1960s United States with a giant flea market superimposed on top of it.
Yeah, tell me about sort of how everything was developing in sort of this post-communist society where there was all of a sudden this complete vacuum of state control, and every commodity that you could think of was now just on the market in a totally laissez-faire capacity where it was very sort of Wild West. Sort of just explain to me how that took shape at that period in time.
Well, the best I can tell you is that whenever I would go into a store, and I'm assuming that most of the stores had been state run at the time of the Soviet Union. Uh, exactly what had happened to those stores and in terms of their ownership was not clear to me, but to the extent that there were stores that were still open, it was very difficult to find anything to buy in them. Empty shelves were all over the place, and it was just very, very difficult to track down any of the necessities that you'd need to live your life in Moscow stores. But what I found, and it was kind of fascinating, was that Muscovites had found a way around that because essentially in different parts of the city, vendors of different types or of similar types of goods were congregating in places where Muscovites would know where to find them. So that, for example, if you were trying to do your grocery shopping, you were looking for vegetables, you'd know to go to this park on this day of the week or these days of the week, and vendors would meet there and goods would exchange hands.
It sort of was just it found a way somehow, and it wasn't anything that was I perceive from what you're saying to be extremely centralized. It seems actually to be quite the opposite. It was just people with petty commodities would show up and trade them in that fashion. It sounds to me.
Yeah,
Can you tell me what currency were they doing all of the trading in?
well, those sorts of transactions were clearly being handled in rubles, although rubles were being made light of for the most part in Moscow.
Surely, if being done with rubles, then they were being done with briefcases full of rubles rather than a handful.
Well, I mean, again, if you're talking
At that
about
point.
if you're talking about buying a tomato, you probably didn't need a bushel of rubles to buy a tomato. But nonetheless, for smaller purchases like, say, vegetables, the rubles were a reasonable currency that you didn't need buckets of. But for any significant purchase, and in almost any kind of commercial, large scale commercial transaction, you were dealing in dollars, and dollars were the only currency that people really wanted. And it was interesting because
tell me about tell me about the guy from Kharkiv and how he ended up in Moscow. Then I suppose is the next logical question.
Yeah, we flew to Moscow, and we were able to meet with the fellow from the Moscow Automotive Institute, the professor there, and we had prearranged with him that we would pay him in U.S. dollars, and that going forward, if we had a good rapport and we're getting along with him, and we wanted him to continue to look for materials for us, that we continue to pay him in U.S. dollars, and of course he was ecstatic about that. And we'd also agreed to essentially have stable currency. And we had agreed to come see the fellow in Kharkov. And it was interesting because once we were in Moscow, the idea of packing up and heading down to Ukraine seemed less appealing. I was there, just to backtrack a little, I was there with a translator who was a professor of Russian at Butler University, who had gone with me to help pave the way, and also to make the arrangements for the trip. And I will backtrack to that one in a little bit, but it dawned on him and it dawned on me that all of us packing ourselves together and heading off to Ukraine would be a bit of a pain. And so he got the bright idea of calling the professor's wife and telling the professor's wife that if she got him on the overnight train from Kharkov to Moscow, that there would be $800 US dollars waiting for him when he got to Moscow. And needless to say, the professor's wife
surely got him on the train, yes. Surely
it got him on the train. It did indeed. A couple of other things, though, that you just keyed in my memory of that trip. One was that the hotel service was very spotty. Again, hotels had been state-run, and they were not really operating like you would think hotels would run. And as a result, I didn't stay in a hotel exactly. I stayed in, and I guess thinking about it, it was essentially in a room at a monastery of some sort that was still in operation in Moscow.
Intact somehow, I suppose.
They had managed to survive by keeping a very low profile through the Soviet years, and were still alive and kicking. And my professor friend from Butler University had contacts there, and they rented us rooms while we were there to stay instead of hotel rooms. And one other story about the issue of Muscovites knowing where to go for things. I was able to get out and get
Surely
away
you had
from.
time to roam around the city a bit, I suppose, and maybe not interact with
I
them
had
per
a
se. But
I had a little bit of time to roam around the city, and as I was doing that, I came upon a very large intersection, multiple roads convening in the same intersection. I had to get across this intersection, and the way to do it was an underpass under the intersection. And as I'm walking down the underpass, I noticed that the underpass is lined by Muscovites with cardboard boxes, and the cardboard boxes all contained puppies or kittens.
I
And it
suppose you had
just
found
seemed to
the
me, and it
animal
looked
shelter.
quite clear, like if you were looking for a puppy or a kitten, if you were looking for a puppy or a kitten in Moscow, this is where you came. And again, sort of the word of mouth made it clear that this is where you went to find a puppy or a kitten in Moscow, to this silly intersection and
Again,
this
just
underpass under the
so
intersection.
interesting how all of that just somehow managed to congeal and organize itself in really a small period of time. But I mean, surely in walking around the streets,
Yeah, because it hadn't been a long, and, and that was for things to find a way to transfer themselves from state ownership to private ownership. Yesterday, and it was a little bit of a fail. One of the things that I had sort of forgotten about was that one thing that did seem to be working reasonably well uh, would be small restaurants. And I'm not sure whether that's a result of uh, some private ownership being permitted of things like small restaurants before the fall of communism, and therefore people who maybe had been
I
running
would be
small
unaware of
restaurants
those at least.
under the communist system. Yeah, I'm just not sure, but it did strike me as though you could go get a meal at a restaurant that had been around for a while. That somehow or another the proprietors were able to get hold of the goods that they needed to prepare meals, and you could, in addition to the local McDonald's, which I actually walked in and bought a Big Mac.
Which I
Four
believe
rubles, I
it's the
believe.
one at the
The
Kremlin.
McDonald's.
Yeah, no, it was the one that was underneath the Kremlin wall, correct? Which I was saddened to hear had just closed due to the Western brands pulling out of Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was within a couple blocks from the Kremlin, if my recollection is right. A couple blocks from the Kremlin wall.
Yeah, I mean,
But nonetheless, it was a time where rubles weren't really worth much, but people got by because that's what they had.
I mean, it must have
And
been just so fascinating to see all of it,
I think
taking
people,
shape.
my impression from the people, again, it struck me as though people were pretty optimistic at the time that
Yeah, no.
even though the ruble
Tell me,
value
yeah, a
of the
little bit
ruble
about
was
the
really low.
atmosphere and the attitude of the people. And I mean, not only of just like, I mean, the atmosphere in Moscow. I mean, clearly it's behind the United States in many key facets. Right after the fall of communism, and you can see that very clearly with that brief period of information that you could get about Russia at that point. Um, and I really am interested to hear about like just what the general atmosphere was, and also
Well, if
maybe the attitudes of some of the Russians, because I mean you were around some Russians that are quite intelligent, by those standards, and perhaps, I mean, maybe even a sense of optimism with Yeltsin and the democratization process. If you would just explain.
It was interesting, and in particular with regard to the the professors from the two automotive institutes. I think they understood that their automotive technology was lagging, and the other major German manufacturers of cars. And I think they were cautiously optimistic that they'd be able to operate under a new system and try to catch up. And they were really, I think, pretty optimistic that they'd be able to catch up.
Very
so on the
unfortunate
technology
as
front,
it
there was
actually
some
turns out.
hopefulness that they, by the same token, the individual people that I spoke to, people at the monastery or whatever that was exactly, the religious place that I
Perhaps
stayed,
some type of
and
Sobor or
people
something
that I
like
met.
that, but small
Yeah,
cathedral of sorts.
but the regular people with whom I spoke were they were annoyed that their rubles weren't worth much, and they were annoyed at how difficult it was to get the goods they needed to survive in everyday life. But they were struggling through, and they were acquiring the things they needed, maybe not as quickly and readily as they wanted to, and maybe it was a bigger pain, but they were hopeful that a new system might well be able to be put in
Yeah,
place that would modernize life and improve their standard of living.
it really does just go though to speak to
Whether
just
that's
how,
happened or not.
unfortunately it all sort of unraveled and how quickly it did. I still recall um, my former professor at the last school, who was the diplomat's son, telling this one story about how in 1995 he took a trip to the Russian Federation, also Moscow, and presumably in the same places. And I I just remember him always talking about there was this old babushka lady and her daughter that were out just on the street selling pornography magazines, and my teacher, he went out and he bought all of them and just gave them like 40 or 50 US dollars. I think in what was more than fair trade at the time. But it really is sort of a little bit staggering to note how in 3 years really not a lot had changed very much, if primary sources are to be believed in this instance. A very funny story in and of itself, regardless. Yeah. But
yeah, but I think they were pretty hopeful that things would improve, and whether they did or they didn't is certainly an interesting question.
I don't know how interesting it is given the present situation. I mean, how much of the situation now? I suppose it's a good it's a good question to ask. I would like your insight on this. Just being somebody that lived through it, a very tumultuous period in Russian history, and being there firsthand, then having been sentient for it, grown up through it all, understanding it all, and even then being from a Western perspective. I mean, how much of it can you really relate to what you're seeing now?
Well, I think it's a very, very different situation. I think people are genuinely concerned about what's going on. That I think they're worried things are going in the wrong direction, and while the ruble's having the same problems in effect that it had back in the post-Soviet days, I think it's concerning because people just aren't sure how this is going to turn out for the better. That that the country would get itself going, that the currency would right itself, and now that's certainly without. And I suspect that I'm obviously not there and don't know, but I suspect that the reaction's very different, at least psychologically. Again, it was more hopeful for sure, and I'm sure right now it's more hopeless in some sense that the world's ganging up on even the Soviet people, not intentionally directed to the people, but nonetheless, their rubles are becoming valueless, and I'm sure they're going to have trouble soon buying the things they need
Well, I think that you
and
can
getting
already
by.
see that.
So,
I'm aware of many of my Russian friends telling me that some of their friends who are not as well off are having to wait once again in lines. And it's funny, there is one ATM in all of St. Petersburg which disperses U.S. dollars, is my understanding. And they all lined up for it, and it ran out of money, and they had to shoo them all away, which it's very
yep.
reminiscent of the old days, it seems to me, but maybe in a more of a destitute
Yeah,
situation,
and
very unfortunately.
the interesting situation then was how they were actually. I mean, and it's I guess the same problem. How are you going to get dollars into the country now as it was a problem then?
Right.
Which is one of the funny things. I mean, we were sort of welcomed by dollars, and that was a fabulous way to grease the skids. You know, you were asking before about whether I had any contacts with the Russian mafia
Yeah, I did
when I
want to
was
know
there,
about that. I
and it
mean,
was
how did you have to
interesting because
navigate around that? Yeah.
well, the short answer is that I didn't have any contacts with those people, but my handlers, if you will, my translator, and the people with whom I was staying, and the people who were hosting me, I guess is the best way to put it, were very careful to make sure that I cleared with them what I was going to do, if I was going to go wandering, if I was going to go out for a meal, if I was going to go out on my own at all. They wanted to know where I was going and wanted to make sure that they approved it. And they were very careful about it, and certainly wanted to make sure that this American running about town wasn't going to get himself in trouble, especially running around town with dollars to spend. So while I didn't have any direct contact, there was a recognition by the people in Moscow that there was some dangerous folks about, and that they wanted to make sure that I um, stayed as safe as I could, and didn't get into any trouble while I was
Yeah,
there. So
the
it was kind
whole
of a chuckle.
gangster capitalism deal. Really, I mean, I suppose, although they maybe related somewhat, although perhaps not so as well entwined as the rise of the oligarchs with, just the imperfections of shock therapy and the massive chasms that it created in society that
Well,
I
the
suppose
the fact of the
they
matter
were
is,
able to fill very
it
easily with
was
some speculation. It
the,
has
the
to.
the thing was the situation there. The you know, it, it, it was kind of a free for all to see who could end up with what.
I suppose
And
therein lies
while most
the real
everyday
dangers
people were
of,
just struggling to get by,
yeah, of deregulated capitalism, just sort of laissez-faire, letting everything go, and not caring about regulating anything at all. I suppose is that opposite end of the spectrum to, you know, what 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 can happen if everything is controlled by the government? What happens if everything is controlled by the populace? And it appears that the results seem to be no better, if not worse.
well, I mean, it's just like you go back to Teddy Roosevelt's day in this country. I mean, when
Yeah.
capitalism was unfettered in the early industrial era here, I mean, it got out of control, and Teddy Roosevelt had to bust the trusts
Yeah.
and try to keep things on track. Now,
Unfortunately, in
you
Russia,
can
I
argue whether whether the JP Morgan, but nonetheless, unfettered capitalism has its problems too.
I
And
suppose a good
really, it was
dichotomy
a
there.
pretty, and really, it was a pretty wide open situation in Moscow. I mean, people were doing their best to get by, but there were people who were looking to get by in ways that were less than above board too. So It was it was a fascinating place. I've never experienced anything before or before or like it before or since. I guess is the way I want to put it.
And I doubt that
But it
you
was
will ever
fascinating to be
again.
there,
You know,
and it's a shame it hasn't worked out for
it is very unfortunate.
what
I
has worked out
suppose
very well
I
for the
suppose
average Russian.
yeah. Well, I suppose though that if there's anything that you want to say to leave the conversation on, now is your time to oblige yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I hopefully this thing that's going on now will abate itself. But and again, I don't think oligarchy is anything to write home about in terms of a beneficial system for. I'm just hoping someday the Russian citizens will get more control over their government and more control over their means of production and more control over their everyday lives, which they don't seem to have right now. Certainly,
A
there's no
a
free
very
press in Russia now,
yeah, a very fine
and
sentiment,
quite
I would say.
frankly, that was another area where all of a sudden, a real before 1992, there was and information was starting to get around, and people were pretty hopeful on that score too. So.
I suppose though, reasonable sentiments to end on. Dad, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure, and it's always interesting to hear you talk about these types of things. So I will bid you adieu.
Hope it's helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.